Ford is recalling more than 277,000 trucks.
Big question because you have the aluminum panels now. You've retooled this plant, you're retooling the Kansas City plant.
America's best-selling truck is breaking down in ways Ford never wanted you to see. EcoBoost engines, once sold as unstoppable, are now failing after just a few thousand miles. Valves shatter, pistons explode, and families are left stranded on highways. But here's the part Ford downplayed. This isn't just an inconvenience, it's a threat to safety and wallets alike. Why are F-150s stalling without warning? Why were complaints ignored for years? And what happens when your truck catches fire before the fix ever arrives? Consumer discovery. What happens when the symbol of American reliability betrays the very drivers who built its legend? That is the question thousands of Ford F-150 owners are now asking after learning that their beloved trucks hide a defect that could bring the engine to a grinding halt. For decades, the F-150 has been more than a vehicle. It has been a cultural marker, a statement of strength, and the best-selling pickup in the United States year after year. Yet recently, owners have begun discovering a flaw so severe it shatters the illusion of invincibility. The problem lies deep inside the engine block. Reports revealed that intake valves in certain EcoBoost engines can fracture unexpectedly. Instead of lasting hundreds of thousands of miles as promised, some trucks experienced catastrophic failure in as little as 10,000 miles. When a valve breaks apart and drops into a cylinder, the result is immediate chaos. The engine stalls, pistons shatter, and the truck that once felt unstoppable becomes little more than roadside scrap metal. Drivers described the experience as terrifying. One moment they were towing a trailer or carrying their families, the next they were fighting to keep a dead vehicle from drifting across lanes. Many say they felt betrayed because they chose the F-150, not just for style, but for trust. A trust now broken. But as frightening as these failures are on their own, the real story emerges when we look at what happens next, because the danger does not end with one engine stalling. Safety dimension. Imagine cruising down the interstate at 70 miles per hour when, without warning, your engine sputters and dies. The steering stiffens, the brakes grow heavy, and behind you traffic barrels forward at deadly speed. This is not a nightmare scenario dreamed up by critics. It is the lived reality of drivers whose F-150 engines failed without a whisper of warning. The silent danger of stalling has turned an engineering defect into a public safety crisis. Safety regulators have long warned that loss of motive power is among the most dangerous mechanical failures. When an engine suddenly quits, drivers lose not only acceleration, but also power-assisted steering and braking. For an ordinary car, this is bad enough, but for a full-size pickup weighing well over 5,000 pounds, the risk multiplies. Add in towing loads, busy highways, or wet roads, and the consequences can be catastrophic. Owners recount near misses that leave them shaken. One driver reported his truck shutting off while merging onto a highway, forcing him to wrestle the wheel as horns blared. Another described the terror of losing power while pulling a horse trailer, praying the truck's momentum would carry them safely off the road. These are not minor inconveniences. They are the kinds of failures that endanger not only the driver, but every motorist sharing the road. And yet safety is only one dimension of the pain. For many owners, the nightmare did not end once the truck was towed to a service center. That is where an even harsher reality emerged: the staggering cost of being left unprotected. If you've made it this far, you already see how deep this story runs. Subscribe to our channel and drop a comment. Your voice matters in exposing what's really happening. Financial pain. The financial fallout from these defects strikes owners like a second blow. For many, buying a Ford F-150 meant investing $30,000 to $60,000 into a truck they expected to last for years. Instead, they found themselves saddled with repair bills climbing into the thousands. When valves shatter or engines seize, repairs often require full replacements, leaving owners with invoices rivaling the down payment on a new home. Warranty coverage, which should serve as a safety net, has become a battleground. Some drivers report being denied coverage because failures occurred just outside mileage limits, while others face delays stretching for weeks due to parts shortages. A truck that once promised freedom and utility becomes a stranded asset, parked uselessly, while the bank still demands monthly payments. Owners who attempt to sell or trade in their vehicles find another shock. Resale values have plummeted. Dealers hesitate to accept F-150s linked to defective engines, and private buyers demand steep discounts. The psychological toll is equally heavy. Families that counted on their trucks for work or travel are left scrambling to borrow vehicles, rent substitutes, or absorb lost income. The sense of betrayal grows deeper when they realize Ford's iconic workhorse has turned into a financial trap. But while consumers struggle with bills and broken promises, the company responsible faced a choice: come clean quickly and repair the damage, or attempt to contain the story. The next chapter shows which path Ford chose. Ford's initial response. Did Ford move too late? Or worse, did it try to move too quietly? As reports mounted, the company eventually acknowledged the defect, issuing recalls covering hundreds of thousands of vehicles. Letters were sent to owners urging them to bring trucks in for inspection. Press statements described the issue as limited and stressed Ford's commitment to safety. On the surface, this looked like corporate responsibility. Yet many consumer advocates argue the response was slow and incomplete. Complaints to regulators dated back years before the recall, suggesting Ford may have known of the risk earlier. The remedies offered often left drivers waiting months for parts or temporary fixes. Some mechanics reported being instructed to replace only certain components, rather than addressing the underlying flaw. Owners who had already paid for costly repairs were told reimbursement would take time, if it came at all. This gap between corporate messaging and lived experience deepened anger. Instead of reassurance, Ford's statements sounded like damage control. Critics accused the company of treating safety as a public relations challenge, rather than a human issue. For a brand built on the promise of toughness and trust, this was not merely a defect, it was a credibility crisis. And as the scandal widened, it became clear this was not an isolated defect at all. The valve failures were only the opening act in a drama that would soon expose a much larger pattern of engineering chaos. Fuel system collapse. When the pump fails, the engine dies. That is the grim reality facing countless Ford F-150 owners as fuel pump defects joined the growing list of mechanical nightmares. Trucks once advertised as unstoppable workhorses began stalling without warning, leaving drivers stranded on highways, in intersections, and even while hauling heavy loads. The culprit was traced to faulty fuel pump modules supplied to Ford, components that could suddenly fail to deliver fuel to the engine. The problem revealed something deeper than a simple parts malfunction. Modern supply chains are global, complex, and heavily cost-driven. Engineers later admitted that the design had vulnerabilities overlooked in testing, while suppliers under pressure to deliver at scale allowed flawed parts to slip through. What looked like an isolated defect was, in fact, a symptom of systemic cracks and oversight. For drivers, the outcome was simple but devastating. Engines sputtered and cut out, often in situations where seconds could mean the difference between a safe stop and a dangerous collision. For Ford, the issue meant yet another recall. Hundreds of thousands of vehicles were called back, adding staggering costs to a company already fighting fires. But as damaging as the fuel pump scandal was, another defect soon surfaced that carried even greater terror. This time, the risk was not stalling, it was fire. Fire hazard engineering. Oil where it should not be can turn any vehicle into a hazard, but in the case of recent Ford F-150 models, a misaligned engine plug transformed trusted trucks into potential fire traps. Investigators found that cup plugs, meant to keep oil contained within engine walls, were sometimes installed incorrectly during assembly. When they shifted under pressure, oil could leak directly onto hot surfaces, sparking smoke, flames, or even full-blown fires. For safety engineers and emergency responders, this defect was a nightmare. Fire departments reported incidents where trucks erupted in flames with little warning. Owners described pulling over after smelling smoke, only to see fire licking up from under the hood. Videos posted online showed once proud trucks reduced to charred shells on the side of the road. What made this failure especially troubling was its unpredictability. A vehicle might run perfectly for months before a minor shift in the plug created a catastrophic leak. Families traveling long distances faced the horrifying possibility of their vehicle igniting without warning. Ford recalled thousands of units and insisted the defect was limited, but the damage to public confidence was severe. These back-to-back crises, first the stalling from fuel pump failures, then the fires from misaligned plugs, forced analysts to step back and ask the bigger question: could this really be a string of bad luck? Or was something far more systematic at work inside Ford's factories? Pattern recognition. One defect is a mistake, several is a pattern. By the time multiple recalls were piling up, industry analysts and watchdog groups began connecting the dots. The narrative was no longer about a few bad parts, but about a troubling decline in Ford's overall quality control. Each new scandal appeared not in isolation, but as part of a chain reaction revealing deep flaws in oversight, testing, and accountability. Analysts pointed out that Ford had been racing to modernize its lineup, pivoting to electric trucks, and retooling plants under tight deadlines. In that rush, some argued corners were cut. Quality assurance teams struggled to keep pace with accelerated production schedules. Suppliers delivered parts that were not adequately stress-tested. Managers, eager to meet ambitious targets, pushed vehicles out the door before engineers could verify every fix. The result was a pattern that looked alarmingly consistent: stalling engines, fire risks, fractured valves, and ballooning recall lists. Watchdogs noted that Ford was not alone in facing recall challenges, but the sheer volume and severity of its defects stood out. When the best-selling truck in America repeatedly showed life-threatening flaws, the problem was not perception, it was performance. And as industry observers sharpened their critiques, another group of players entered the battlefield. Lawyers, regulators, and federal investigators began circling, determined to turn evidence into accountability. Legal frontline. Lawyers circle as the evidence piles up, and Ford's mounting scandals became fertile ground for litigation. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration opened formal probes into engine stalls, oil leaks, and fire hazards. Each recall was scrutinized to determine whether Ford acted quickly enough or whether it downplayed risks until forced by public outcry. Class action lawsuits soon followed, filed by groups of owners who claimed they were left paying thousands for repairs that should have been covered. Some suits alleged Ford knowingly sold defective vehicles while failing to warn customers, a charge that carries both financial and reputational danger. Consumer rights groups rallied behind plaintiffs, amplifying their stories and demanding harsher penalties. Inside courtrooms, the battle lines were clear. Ford's legal teams argued the company had acted responsibly, pointing to recalls and warranty extensions as evidence of good faith. But critics countered that recalls came too late and remedies were insufficient. The cost of settlements, combined with regulatory fines, threatened to climb into the hundreds of millions, placing yet another burden on Ford's already strained balance sheet. What began as mechanical failures was now a legal war, one where every engine defect translated into evidence, every delayed fix into liability. Yet while courtrooms filled with arguments, the fallout was not confined to judges and lawyers. Beyond the legal frontline, the scandal was beginning to unravel Ford's own ecosystem, from dealers to workers to Wall Street itself. Dealer dilemma. The customer anger dealers could not escape hit like a storm. Across the country, Ford dealerships became the frontline shock absorbers for the engine scandal. Owners furious about broken trucks, unanswered questions, and months-long delays did not storm Ford's headquarters in Michigan. They marched straight into local showrooms and service centers, demanding answers and demanding fixes. Sales staff and service managers suddenly found themselves in the impossible position of defending a company decision they had no part in making. Repair backlogs mounted with stunning speed. Some dealerships reported waiting lists stretching for weeks, even months, as defective engines piled up and replacement parts failed to arrive on time. Service bays filled with half-disassembled trucks, while frustrated customers shouted in waiting rooms. The shortage of loaner vehicles compounded the tension, leaving many owners stranded without transportation for work or family duties. For dealership staff, the crisis strained relationships built over decades. Salespeople who once proudly handed over F-150 keys now fielded angry calls from the same customers. Service advisors who prided themselves on reliability faced insults, threats, and emotional breakdowns from drivers whose livelihoods depended on their trucks. The dealership, meant to symbolize community trust, instead became the lightning rod for national outrage. But the storm did not stay confined to showrooms and service bays. On the resale lots of America, the very foundation of the F-150's market dominance began to collapse. Used truck market. A Legend's resale value collapses when confidence vanishes, and that is exactly what happened to the once mighty F-150 in the used truck market. For decades, the vehicle was considered a safe bet. Buyers knew that even after years of use, the truck held value like few others. Dealers advertised it as a vehicle that could outlast competitors, and private sellers often commanded strong prices. But the engine scandal tore that reputation to shreds. Buyers became cautious, then downright fearful. Word spread quickly through forums, social media, and local communities that certain engines could fail catastrophically. Used car shoppers who once drove hours to find a pre-owned F-150 began walking away from deals, unwilling to risk inheriting someone else's nightmare. Even sellers with unaffected trucks struggled, as buyers could not tell the difference between a safe vehicle and a defective one. The numbers told the story in cold, brutal terms. Resale prices dropped sharply in regions where recalls hit hardest. Dealers who relied on the steady churn of used pickups saw inventory stagnate on lots, their investments depreciating with each passing week. Private sellers, desperate to offload their trucks, slashed prices far below expectations. What had been a guaranteed value proposition turned into a market paralysis that rippled through rural towns, construction companies, and families alike. And when the used market falters for a brand built on resale trust, the shockwaves inevitably reach investors. Wall Street began to notice, and the reaction was swift. Wall Street alarm. When trucks misfire, the stock market listens. As recalls mounted and consumer outrage swelled, Ford's financial reputation took a pounding. Investors who once viewed the company as a steady, if conservative bet, began to reassess the risks. Each recall notice represented not only a technical failure, but a looming financial liability. Analysts calculated warranty expenses climbing into the hundreds of millions, while legal settlements loomed like storm clouds on the horizon. Stock prices reflected the unease. Ford shares dipped whenever new recall numbers hit the news, and analysts issued cautious notes, warning clients that the company's quality control issues could undermine long-term profitability. Hedge funds and institutional investors debated whether the F-150, once Ford's crown jewel, was becoming a liability that could drag down the broader brand. Financial media amplified the story, turning engine defects into headlines about corporate stability. Questions about executive oversight, board responsibility, and future earnings dominated investor calls. Behind closed doors, Ford's leadership faced growing pressure from shareholders demanding accountability, strategy shifts, and cost containment. Yet the financial crisis was only one layer of fallout. Beneath the boardrooms and stock tickers, inside the very factories where the F-150 was built, another storm was brewing. Workers on the assembly lines felt the weight of the scandal in every shift, every inspection, and every whispered conversation with union leaders. Worker strain. Assembly lines under pressure, unions on edge. This was the human face of Ford's engine scandal. Inside factories in Michigan and beyond, workers felt the stress of trying to keep production moving, while knowing that vehicles rolling off the line might face recalls weeks later. Quality inspectors faced stricter protocols, engineers pushed for design changes, and line workers endured relentless overtime meant to catch up on delayed shipments. Morale plummeted. Employees who once wore Ford's blue oval with pride now spoke of shame and frustration. Union representatives reported a surge in grievances, with workers citing burnout, unsafe conditions, and constant tension between management's demand for speed and employees' pleas for precision. Overtime pay softened the blow for some, but money could not erase the exhaustion of 12-hour shifts spent under a cloud of distrust. The scandal also threatened job security. Rumors circulated that Ford might shift more production overseas to reduce costs from recalls and lawsuits. Layoff fears mingled with anger at executives who, in the eyes of many workers, ignored warnings and cut corners that led to the crisis. The shop floor, once a source of steady pride, became a cauldron of resentment and fatigue. And yet, even as Ford's internal ecosystem strained under the weight of scandal, the ripples did not stop there. Beyond the company itself, the shockwaves were reshaping the broader auto industry, government policy, and the very expectations of consumers worldwide. We're only scratching the surface of what's unfolding. If you never want to miss the truth behind these scandals, subscribe right now, because the next chapter is already coming, and you'll want to be here when it does. Competitor counterpunch. Rivals did not wait. They pounced. As Ford scrambled to contain the fallout from its engine scandal, General Motors, Ram, and Toyota spotted an opening that was too valuable to ignore. Pickup sales in America are not just numbers on spreadsheets. They are battles for loyalty in a market where image and trust mean everything. Ford's stumble gave competitors a golden opportunity to claim ground they had been chasing for decades. General Motors seized the moment with aggressive campaigns, highlighting the durability of Chevrolet Silverado engines, subtly suggesting that buyers could still have muscle without the fear of breakdowns. Ram doubled down on luxury features and reliability, framing its trucks as the modern alternative to Ford's troubled legacy. Toyota leaned into its reputation for long-term dependability, running advertisements that emphasized consistent quality over flashy innovation. The shift was not just in marketing. Dealers for these rivals reported surges in test drives and inquiries, many from frustrated Ford owners desperate for alternatives. Market share statistics soon reflected the shift. Where Ford once dominated without challenge, competitors now chipped away, presenting themselves as guardians of trust in a shaken market. And as competitors sharpened their knives, lawmakers and regulators smelled blood too. The scandal was no longer a consumer issue alone, it became a political spectacle. Government and policy? The hearings no automaker wants to face soon arrived. Members of Congress, emboldened by voter outrage, summoned Ford executives to Washington. In televised sessions, lawmakers grilled company leaders on why defects were not caught earlier, why recalls dragged on, and why ordinary Americans were left footing repair bills. For Ford, it was a humiliating parade played out before millions of viewers. Regulators piled on with their own demands. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration announced stricter oversight of engine testing protocols, warning that tolerance for repeated defects had ended. Proposals circulated for heavier fines, mandatory third-party inspections, and even criminal liability for executives who concealed safety risks. State attorneys general launched investigations, while consumer rights groups lobbied for expanded lemon laws to protect buyers. Policy implications stretched further still. The White House weighed in, framing the scandal as evidence of why America must strengthen domestic manufacturing standards. International trade officials watched closely too, concerned that Ford's troubles could tarnish the image of American vehicles abroad. What began as an engine defect now shaped debates on regulation, corporate responsibility, and consumer trust. But while lawmakers sparred with executives, ordinary families felt the financial strain in ways politicians could never fully capture. That pain radiated into the wider economy. Insurance bills and repair costs that hit us all soon followed. Insurers, facing a surge in claims tied to stalling trucks and engine fires, quietly adjusted their risk models. Premiums ticked upward, not just for Ford owners but across the pickup category, as companies spread risk across the entire market. Families already squeezed by inflation faced yet another monthly cost they could not avoid. Repair shops, meanwhile, became overrun. Independent mechanics and authorized dealerships alike struggled to meet demand for replacements, driving up labor costs. Parts shortages caused by recalls spilled into other models, slowing repairs even for unrelated vehicles. Small businesses dependent on trucks for work, landscapers, contractors, delivery operators, absorbed both downtime and higher bills, sometimes forcing them to pass costs onto customers. Warranty expenses ballooned for Ford, straining suppliers and sending ripples through the Midwest economy, where auto jobs anchor local communities. Analysts warned that the cumulative effect of recalls, lawsuits, and repair costs could cut billions from Ford's bottom line, forcing belt-tightening across factories, suppliers, and even advertising budgets. The scandal had grown into more than a Ford problem. It was reshaping how Americans experienced mobility, finance, and daily life. And with every ripple, the story revealed a sobering truth. If the F-150 could fail, nothing was sacred. The bigger lesson: if this can happen to America's favorite truck, it can happen to any car. That was the chilling realization that spread beyond Ford showrooms and into living rooms across the nation. The F-150 was not just another pickup. It was the gold standard, the icon of durability. Its collapse forced consumers everywhere to question whether trust in any brand was still deserved. The scandal also arrived during a pivotal transition for the auto industry. Electric vehicles and artificial intelligence-driven systems were touted as the next frontier, but the Ford fiasco raised urgent questions. If traditional engines, refined over a century, could fail so catastrophically, how could consumers trust experimental batteries or autonomous software? Skepticism grew that flashy innovation might be masking even bigger risks. The lesson was stark. Reliability cannot be an afterthought. Whether gas-powered or electric, whether built in Detroit or Shanghai, every vehicle depends on rigorous quality control, transparent communication, and corporate accountability. Consumers learned to demand more, regulators hardened their stance, and rivals realized that reputation could shift overnight. And while Ford fights to rebuild, the shadow of its scandal lingers as a warning across the industry. The next chapter of American mobility will be shaped not by horsepower alone, but by whether companies earn back the trust they once took for granted. They said the Ford F-150 was America's unbreakable truck, But now, we know even legends can crack. What we uncovered together wasn't just about engines, or even one company. It was about trust, power, and the choices shaping our roads and our lives. If this can happen to the most celebrated pickup in history, it can happen anywhere. The story doesn't stop here, and neither should you. Stay alert, stay questioning, and never accept the surface answer. Because the real truth, it's always deeper, and when it breaks through, you'll want to be ready to face it.